Have you ever just stopped and, genuinely wondered what the most fundamental building blocks of reality really are?
Uh-huh.
Not atoms or quarks, not the physical bits, but maybe something, well, even more basic, something maybe not physical at all,
It's a huge question.
right? Or maybe you've puzzled over that ancient mystery. How does this thing we call a mind, this, world of thoughts and feelings, how does it connect with your physical body, your cells, your nerves?
The mind-body problem, still wrestling with it today.
Exactly. These are deep, persistent questions. And centuries ago, one brilliant philosopher proposed this vision, a system so intricate, so surprising, maybe even elegant, a truly radical answer.
And that philosopher was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a real polymath philosopher, mathematician, scientist, diplomat, you name it. He lived in this incredibly fertile intellectual period, grappling with Descartes, Spinoza, the scientific revolution.
A lot going on. And the text we're diving into today, the one where he sort of lays out the core of this amazing system, is his Monadology.
That's the one.
It's not long, actually. Quite short. Written late in his life, kind of a concise summary. And our deep dive today, it's built entirely on the sources you've gathered for us. Bits from philosophical encyclopedias for the basics, academic papers really dissecting his arguments, commentaries focused right on the monadology itself, plus selections from his other big works, like the Theodicy that flesh things out.
Right. And Leibniz's goal with the monadology, it was seriously ambitious. He wanted to distill his entire philosophical system into this brief, almost axiomatic format.
Not just one piece of the puzzle.
No, the whole picture. He wanted to lay bare the fundamental metaphysical principles, as he saw them, that govern reality, and crucially, tackle those big puzzles of his time.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to take this dense, powerful text and the sources helping us unpack it and really pull out the core ideas. We want to follow Leibniz's reasoning, get a handle on these, frankly, pretty wild concepts he introduces, and try to piece together the universe he's presenting.
Yeah, to help you see what's really essential, what's driving the system, and maybe, offer some perspectives on reality you hadn't thought about.
It's definitely a trip into abstract territory.
For sure. But we'll take it step by step, make sure we get the significance of each bit as we assemble this complex but pretty beautiful intellectual structure.
Okay, let's start with the why. Why did Leibniz feel the need to build this whole system and then boil it down into the monadology? What were the big philosophical headaches he was trying to cure?
Well, the sources point to a few key drivers, but two really stand out, like you mentioned earlier, the mind-body problem and the relationship between God and creation. These weren't just, abstract games. They were huge challenges for philosophy after Descartes. Leibniz felt the existing answers just weren't cutting it.
And who were the main players offering those answers he was reacting to?
Primarily René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. Let's start with Descartes. The sources lay out his view pretty clearly. Substance dualism.
Dualism. Two kinds of stuff.
Exactly. Two fundamentally different kinds of created substance. You've got thinking substance mind, soul, and extended substance body. Mind has no spatial properties, no size or location in that sense. Body is extension, it takes up space. And Descartes thought these two distinct things actually caused changes in each other.
Interactionism.
Interactionism,
Yeah,
right. The mind wills the arm to move, the body feels a pinprick and signals pain to the mind.
Which, that feels right, doesn't it? That matches our everyday experience.
Phenomenologically, yes, absolutely. It feels like interaction. But, and this is the big but the sources hammer home, Descartes really struggled to explain how. How could something non-spatial, the mind, possibly push or pull on something spatial, the body? Or the other way around? Where is the connection point?
Yeah, how does the thought exert force?
Precisely. Our sources even quote Leibniz pointing out that Descartes, brilliant as he was, basically gave up the attempt to give a clear mechanism for it. This failure of dualism to really bridge that gap between mind and body was a major philosophical itch Leibniz needed to scratch.
Okay, so Descartes had the dualism interaction puzzle. What about Spinoza? He went in a completely different direction, didn't he? Monism.
Radically different. Spinoza said, forget multiple created substances. There's only one substance, God or nature. Everything else, mind, body, thought, extension, these are just attributes or modes of that single infinite substance.
So everything is just God.
In a way, yes, but the sources highlight a really critical difference between Spinoza and Leibniz concerning God and creation. For Spinoza, God's nature is absolutely necessary. Everything flows from God's essence with, like, geometrical certainty. There's no real choice or contingency in Spinoza's universe. It just has to be this way.
Like a divine machine running according to fixed laws.
Pretty much. And that necessitarianism, Leibniz couldn't accept it. The Theodicy excerpts really bring this out.
Yeah.
Leibniz believed God chose to create this world. He chose the best possible world out of an infinite number of possibilities that existed in his understanding.
Choice based on goodness.
Choice based on goodness and perfection, yeah. That leads to a world that is contingent. It could have been otherwise, which is central to Leibniz and pulls apart from Spinoza's strict necessity. So Leibniz wasn't just offering another system with the monadology. He was trying to thread a needle, right? Solve the mind-body problem Descartes left hanging, but without falling into what he saw as the deterministic trap of Spinoza's monism. He wanted a rational account of everything, reality, mind, body, God, that still allowed for contingency and divine free choice.
And he packed all of that, all those arguments and responses, into this one short, dense text.
Incredibly dense. It's structured very unusually numbered paragraphs, like axioms and theorems. He's assuming you can follow tight, logical steps. Every single sentence is loaded, referencing his wider philosophy, engaging with Descartes, Spinoza, others. That's why, even though you can read it quickly, you could spend a lifetime unpacking it.
Which is why we need these guiding sources.
Exactly. They help us see the layers built into this compact little work. It's like the concentrated essence of his entire thought.
All right, that sets the stage perfectly. We see the problems he faced, the giants he was wrestling with, and the sheer ambition of the project. Now, let's get to the core of his solution, the monads. This is where I think things start to feel really different from our usual picture of the world. What is a monad, according to Leibniz?
Okay, so M1, the very first proposition, tells us monads are simple substances, and simple is the absolute key here. It means without parts.
Without parts. Okay, like an indivisible point, a fundamental particle you can't split.
And here's the first big twist, the thing the sources really stress. Monads are not physical atoms. They are not points in space. M4 makes it crystal clear. They are indivisible, yes, but also unextended, non-spatial, and fundamentally spiritual substances.
Whoa. Okay, hang on. Unextended. Non-spatial. Spiritual. So the basic building blocks of reality aren't physical stuff.
Nope. Not according to Leibniz. That's a radical break from the atomists, from the mechanical philosophers of his day. For him, the physical world we perceive isn't the ultimate reality. The bedrock reality is made of these non-physical, simple, spiritual entities.
That is genuinely mind-bending.
It is. And this non-spatial nature, this lack of parts, leads directly to maybe their most famous and definitely most counterintuitive feature, M7. Monads are windowless.
Windowless, what does that even mean?
It means nothing external can get into or out of a monad, but more crucially, it means monads do not causally interact with each other. There's no push or pull, no influence passing between them. They are, in terms of external cause and effect, totally sealed off.
Okay, wait. If the fundamental bits of reality are sealed off from each other and don't interact, how does anything happen? How does the universe change? How does it even look like things affect each other? This seems like a huge problem.
It's the central puzzle his system has to solve, absolutely. And Leibniz's answer is ingenious, if strange. All changes within a monad come entirely from within the monad itself. M18 calls them incorporeal automata.
Automata, like little spiritual machines.
Kind of. They contain the source of their own actions, their own changes internally. Their entire history, the whole sequence of their future states, is somehow preloaded, contained within their very nature, unfolding according to an internal principle.
So a monad isn't looking around and reacting to its neighbors. It's just playing out its own internal script.
Exactly. It's unfolding a sequence determined by its own essence. And the engine driving this internal unfolding, Leibniz says, consists of two primary qualities inherent in every single created monad. These are mentioned in M14, M19, and detailed in the appendix source, perception and appetition.
Perception and appetition. Okay, is that like sensing things and wanting things?
Related, but much broader and more technical in Leibniz's system. Perception, according to M14, is the monad's internal state that represents or expresses the entire universe.
The entire universe.
The entire universe, yes, but from its own unique point of view, M57. Remember, it's windowless, so it's not getting sense data from outside. It's an internal representation, an inner state that mirrors or reflects the state of everything else. Think of it less like seeing, more like a dynamic internal reflection of the cosmos.
Okay, an internal representation. And appetition.
Appetition, M15, is the internal drive or tendency within the monad to transition from one perceptual state to the next one in its predetermined sequence. It's the inner force pushing it along its own unique timeline of representations.
So every basic spiritual unit has this internal representation of everything, perception, and an internal push to change that representation over time, appetition.
That's the core dynamic principle for every created monad. Yes, M19.
But if they're all simple, spiritual, windowless, and just have these two drives, couldn't some of them just be identical, like featureless spiritual points?
But Leibniz has another fundamental principle ready for that, mentioned in M9, the principle of the identity of indiscernibles.
Identity of indiscernibles. Sounds important.
It is. It states, quite simply, that no two monads in the entire universe are ever exactly alike. Every single simple substance is unique.
But how? If they have no spatial properties and are windowless, what makes them different?
The sources explain they can't just be bare particulars, things that just are, without any qualities. That's from the M9 commentary. They must have qualities. M9 itself says this. And their qualities are precisely these internal states, their perceptions and appetitions, and the unique sequence they follow. If you could hypothetically find two monads that shared every single quality, every internal state, past, present, and future, well, Leibniz says, by this principle, they wouldn't be two distinct monads, they'd just be the same monad. But he insists that in reality, this never happens. Every monad has its own unique qualitative signature.
So the difference lies in their internal programming, their unique sequence of perceptions.
Exactly. And this ties directly into M12 and the idea of the complete specification or complete concept of a substance.
Weird concept.
Yeah. In God's infinite understanding, there exists a complete concept for every individual substance, every monad. This concept contains everything that is true of that monad throughout its entire existence. Think of it like the ultimate blueprint, detailing every internal state it will ever have.
Wow. Like its entire biography written in advance.
Pretty much. And the sources link this back to Leibniz's core idea about truth. Predicatum in a summea subjecto. In any true statement, the concept of the predicate, what's being said about the subject, is already contained within the concept of the subject itself.
Okay, predicatum in a subjecto, predicate in the subject. Can we unpack that a bit more?
Sure. Take a simple statement. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. For Leibniz, for that statement to be true, the concept of crossing the Rubicon must somehow be included within the complete concept of Caesar. Now apply that universally. For any truth about monad X, like monad X perceives state alpha at time t1, or monad X is striving towards state beta, the concept of perceiving alpha at t1, or striving towards beta, must be part of the complete, unique concept of monad X.
I think I get it. So because each monad has this totally unique, infinitely detailed blueprint, its complete concept defining its entire internal history, no two can possibly share all the same predicates, all the same truths about them.
You got it. That's how the principle of the identity of indiscernibles is grounded. It guarantees this infinite variety and uniqueness right down at the fundamental level of reality. Each monad is like a unique living mirror reflecting the whole cosmos from its own angle, and its whole story is encoded within it from the get-go.
Okay. Mind slightly blown, but okay. So we have a universe made of countless, unique, non-interacting, windowless spiritual points, each playing out its own pre-written internal movie of perceptions and strivings. Which brings us right back to that massive question. How does this look like a coordinated, interactive world? How does my deciding to lift my coffee cup actually result in my hand moving? This leads us straight to the next big idea, right? Pre-established harmony. It sounds like it has to be the answer if nothing actually interacts.
It absolutely is. This is Leibniz's signature doctrine, his most famous, perhaps most debated, but utterly ingenious solution to how you get order and apparent interaction in a universe of non-interacting substances.
Pre-established harmony. How does it work? What's pre-established?
The sources, especially M78, explain it like this. God, being the supreme perfect monad, M3841, the ultimate source of everything, didn't just create the monads and let them go. No. At the very instant of creation, God, using his infinite wisdom and power, essentially pre-programmed each and every monad.
Pre-programmed them? How? To do what?
To unfold their unique internal sequence of perceptions and appetitions in perfect, precise, absolute correspondence with the internal unfolding of every other monad in the universe.
Okay, wait. So it's like God wound up a potentially infinite number of clocks at the beginning of time and set them so perfectly that they all strike the hour, chime the quarter, tick the second in perfect unison forever, without any clock actually affecting any other clock.
That's the classic analogy, yeah. usually attributed to him or used by commentators. Two clocks, perfectly made, perfectly synchronized at the start. They always agree not because one influences the other, but because their internal mechanisms were designed from the outset to run in perfect parallel. M51 specifically calls it a harmony of perceptions. Their internal states correspond perfectly.
So when it looks like one thing causes another, like the pin trick causing pain, it's not actual cause and effect.
Not in the sense of direct influence between created substances, no. It's correlation without direct causation. When your mind monad undergoes the internal change corresponding to willing the arm to rise, the multitude of monads that constitute your physical arm are, at that very same instant, undergoing the internal changes corresponding to the arm rising.
Because God set up both sequences to match perfectly from the beginning.
Exactly. M78 and M80 are key here. The mind sequence and the body sequence run in perfect parallel harmony because God designed them that way. There's no mysterious interaction needed.
And this is his solution to the mind-body problem that stumped Descartes.
Precisely, M80. He sidesteps the whole issue of how unextended mind interacts with extended body by saying, they don't. There's just this perfect, God-ordained correlation. And M80 is really interesting because Leibniz brings in physics here. He argued Descartes' interactionism couldn't work because it would violate physical conservation laws, specifically the conservation of the direction of motion, something physics was starting to understand better. Leibniz saw his pre-established harmony as the only way to explain the mind-body connection and the regularity of physics without breaking those laws.
Wow, okay. So in the world we see, the phenomenal world, when one billiard ball strikes another and the second one moves off, what am I actually witnessing?
You're witnessing the coordinated unfolding of the perceptions within the vast number of monads that make up those billiard balls. Bodies, remember, aren't simple substances. They're aggregates, collections of monads. The apparent causality between them, the source material calls this well-founded phenomena.
Well-founded phenomena, meaning it's not just illusion.
Not mere illusion, no. It's grounded in the underlying reality of the monads and their coordinated states. One source, the Monadology guide, says physical reality gets its reality from the congruence of perceptions of apperceiving substances, basically, the consistent agreement between the internal representations of the rational minds observing it. So the causality is phenomenal, it happens in the world of appearances, but it's a direct result of the deeper, non-causal, pre-established harmony among the constituent monads.
That is a truly staggering vision.
Yeah.
A universe perfectly choreographed from moment one. Okay, so we have all these monads, these unique spiritual points, playing their parts. Are they all playing the same kind of part? You mentioned a hierarchy earlier, section 4 in the outline. Degrees of perception.
Right. They are all unique, yes, but they differ enormously in the clarity and distinctness of their internal perceptions. And this difference in clarity creates a spectrum, a hierarchy, or as Leibniz often thought of it, a continuous chain of being throughout the entire universe.
So it's not just what they perceive, but how clearly they perceive it.
Exactly. M49, which the Stanford Encyclopedia source discusses, connects this clarity to activity and passivity. A monad is more active when its perceptions are clear and distinct. It's more passive when its perceptions are confused and obscure.
Okay, so what are the main levels on this ladder of clarity?
Well, at the very bottom, according to M19 and M21, you have what Leibniz calls bare monads.
Bare monads.
These have only extremely confused, obscure perceptions. They're below the threshold of consciousness or awareness. Think of the monads that might constitute, say, a rock or what we consider inanimate matter.
Yeah.
They still have perceptions, internal states representing the universe, but these are what M21 calls little perceptions, petite perceptions.
Little perception.
Yeah, they're too faint, too numerous, too indistinct to be noticed individually. M21 gives that famous analogy of the sound of the sea. You hear the overall roar, right? That's a confused perception made up of the countless tiny sounds of individual waves hitting the shore, none of which you can distinguish on its own. Those individual wave sounds are like the little perceptions of bare monads. The sources also mention that even souls, like ours, can fall into states where they only have these little perceptions, like in deep sleep, a faint, or maybe even what we perceive as death. M21 even suggests death for animals might just be a temporary regression to this state, a kind of sleep they could recover from, because monads themselves can't actually be destroyed naturally.
M4. Okay, so bare monads are the baseline, fuzzy, unconscious perceptions. What's the next level up?
Souls. That's M19 again. Souls have clearer perceptions than bare monads, and crucially, they possess memory. This is the level Leibniz primarily associates with animal.
Memory is the key difference.
It's a huge step up. M26 explains that because animals have memory, they can learn from experience, they form associations, their perceptions become linked. Leibniz calls this learning induction or even the shadow of reason, M26, M28. M27 talks about how repeated experiences strengthen these links in their imagination. Think of a dog expecting a treat when it hears the treat jar open. That's memory and association at work. M28 even points out that humans operate like this a lot of the time. Maybe 3/4 of our actions are merely empiricist, based on habit and association, not true rational thought.
Interesting. So animals have clearer perception plus memory, leading to associative learning, which must mean the top level is
Spirits, or minds. M29 calls them rational souls. This is us, human beings. What sets spirits apart is the capacity for reason, for self-consciousness, which Leibniz calls apperception, and for knowing necessary truths and knowing God, M30.
Okay, reason and self-consciousness. How do those arise, or what do they allow?
M29 and the commentary on M30 are key here. Spirits are raised above mere souls by their knowledge of necessary and eternal truths. Things like mathematical truths, 2 + 2 = 4, or logical principles. These aren't things you learn just by experiencing the world. They seem to be universal, unchanging.
Right, they don't come from the senses.
Exactly. And reflecting on how we know these truths that M30 commentary says must come from what is inside us leads to what M29 calls reflexive acts. This is self-reflection, the ability to turn inwards and think about the I, the self. To think about abstract concepts like being, substance, the simple versus the compound, immaterial things, and ultimately God himself, M30. Reason allows spirits to access these intellectual ideas, these necessary truths, drawn from the mind's own nature, not just reflecting the external world dimly or clearly.
So spirits aren't just quantitatively different, like having more memory or clearer perception. They're qualitatively different, a whole new capacity.
That's the idea. This rational capacity, this self-awareness, makes spirits, in Leibniz's view, images of God, capable of entering into a kind of community with God, what he calls the city of God in another work referenced. So this whole spectrum, bare monads, souls, spirits, based on the clarity of perception, creates this continuous chain of being. And M69 really emphasizes the universe is teeming with life at every level. Nothing is truly dead or chaotic. Apparent deadness is just our confused perception of incredibly complex systems of monads. M70 adds another layer. Any living body, like an animal or human, has a dominant monad or entelechy, the soul or spirit with clearest perception that sort of organizes the whole. But that body itself is composed of innumerable other living things, other monads, each potentially with its own dominant monad at its own level.
Like worlds within worlds within worlds.
Exactly, a nested structure of life and perception all the way down, based on degrees of clarity.
It connects back to his ideas about life and death, too, right?
Yes. If monads are indestructible and always perceiving, then M72 and M74 make the bold claim. There's no true generation or destruction of souls, and no true separation of a soul from some kind of body, aggregate of monads. What looks like birth is just development, unfolding, maybe like observing preformation in seeds, which M74 mentions was a scientific idea then. What looks like death is just enfolding, contraction, the dominant monad perhaps retreating to a state of having only confused perceptions, but it's still there, still associated with some matter. Souls always have bodies, they just transform.
It's a remarkably consistent picture, tying the metaphysics of simple substances right through to biology. Okay, let's shift focus now to the ultimate foundation of all this, God and the striking idea of the best of all possible worlds. Section 5.
God is absolutely the linchpin of the whole system. M38 through M40 identify God as the unique, universal, necessary being. God isn't just another monad, even a super powerful one. God is the ultimate reason for the existence of everything else, why there are monads, why there's harmony, why anything exists rather than nothing. God is the source.
And M41 says God is absolutely perfect. What does perfect mean for Leibniz here?
Perfection, for Leibniz, M41, means the magnitude of positive reality. God, being infinite and without limits, possesses the maximum possible degree of positive reality, of perfection. And it's this infinite perfection, particularly God's infinite wisdom, goodness, and power, that leads directly to his most famous and perhaps most controversial metaphysical doctrine.
The best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
Okay. How does he argue for that? How does that work?
The sources we have, like the Theodicy excerpts and the paper on Leibniz's decision-making, lay it out like this. God, in his infinite understanding, conceives of all possible ways a universe could be. Not just vague ideas, but infinitely many distinct, coherent, possible worlds existing as concepts in the divine mind.
An infinite library of possible universes.
Exactly. And the fact that these other possibilities exist is precisely why our actual world is contingent. It didn't have to be this way. Its existence isn't a necessary truth like 2 + 2 is 4. It exists because God chose it from among all the possibilities.
And out of all those infinite options, God chose this one.
Yes, M55 is explicit. God chose to create the best of all possible worlds.
Okay, but best is the loaded term here, isn't it? Given, well, everything's suffering, earthquakes, evil, how can this be the best possible? That seems like a tough sell.
It's definitely the point that draws the most fire. But we need to understand Leibniz's definition of best, which M58 clarifies. For Leibniz, the best world isn't necessarily the one with the least amount of suffering or imperfection considered in isolation. The best world is the one that contains the greatest amount of perfection overall. And perfection here means the optimal combination of the greatest possible variety of phenomena produced according to the greatest possible order or simplicity of laws.
Maximum variety combined with maximum order.
That's the idea. M57 connects this back to the monads. Having infinitely many unique monads, each mirroring the universe from its own perspective, maximizes the variety. The pre-established harmony ensures the maximum possible order and coherence in how all these perspectives unfold together. So, the best world is the one that hits the sweet spot, the optimal balance between richness and simplicity, maximizing metaphysical reality and perfection as a whole system. God's choice wasn't arbitrary. It was determined by his own perfect nature, his wisdom and goodness, to choose the combination with the most overall reality, but it was still a choice among possibilities. Hypothetically necessary, not absolutely necessary, as the sources say.
Right. And how does this principle then engage with the problem of evil? This is where Voltaire and others really pushed back, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a central theme in his theodicy. Leibniz doesn't deny evil exists, but he tries to reconcile it with God's perfection and the best possible world idea. The sources give us several lines of argument he used. One is that evil might be a logically necessary component of the best overall pattern. The Theodicy excerpt puts it starkly. If the smallest evil daughter were missing, it would no longer be this world. Evils are like, maybe, necessary shadows in the most beautiful possible picture.
A necessary flaw for the greater whole.
That's one angle. Another is that evil is fundamentally a privation, a lack of perfection, rather than a positive force created by God. Or, and this is a key one, sometimes evil is permitted because it's instrumentally necessary for bringing about a greater good that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The Theodicy excerpt says, often an evil brings about a good which would not have obtained without that evil. He uses analogies like musical dissonance making the final harmony richer. God, with his wonderful art, can weave even these defects into the optimal overall design. He also suggests God permits physical evil, like natural disasters, sometimes as a consequence of permitting moral evil, free will, which allows for sin but is itself a great good.
It's a complex argument, trying to justify apparent imperfections.
It is, and controversial. But his core stance is that the specific combination of variety and order, including the evils we see, represents the maximum possible perfection overall. Removing the evil somehow would result in a less perfect, less real universe, according to his calculus. He also insists God's will isn't arbitrary about good and justice. They're based on eternal truths. Theodicy, quoting Bale.
Okay. And within this perfectly chosen, harmonized world, is there a sense of cosmic justice? Do things balance out?
Leibniz argues yes, that's built into the harmony. M89 and M90 talk about the harmony between the physical realm, kingdom of nature, and the moral realm, kingdom of grace, where spirits reside. This ensures that, through the natural unfolding of the pre-established order, virtue is ultimately rewarded and vice punished. M89. It's not necessarily immediate or obvious, but the system itself contains this moral balancing mechanism. M90 echoes the idea that ultimately, everything works out for the good of those who align themselves with God's rational and good order.
It's an incredibly comprehensive, tightly woven system. To really grasp how he built it, we probably need to look at how he understood truth itself. Which brings us to section 6, truths of reason and truths of fact.
Yes, this distinction is absolutely fundamental to his whole project, both his epistemology and his metaphysics. M33 lays it out very clearly. There are two basic kinds of truths.
Okay, what's the first kind?
Truths of reasoning. These are necessary truths, M33. Their opposite is impossible. Denying them leads to a contradiction. These are the truths of logic and pure mathematics. A square has 4 equal sides, Something cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time.
Necessary truths, and how do we know them?
M33 and its commentary explain that we know them through analysis. We can break them down into simpler ideas and truths until ultimately they resolve into fundamental identities like A is A, or showing the predicate is contained in the subject. They are validated by the principle of contradiction. Their denial is logically self-refuting. They are true in all possible worlds, independent of experience.
Got it. Necessary, known by analysis based on non-contradiction. What's the other kind? Truths of fact.
Truths of fact. These are contingent truths, M33. Their opposite is logically possible. These truths concern the actual world, empirical states of affairs. It is sunny outside right now. Caesar was assassinated. This podcast is being recorded.
Things that happen to be true but could have been otherwise. How do we know these are true? Or rather, what makes them true?
Not the principle of contradiction, because their opposite isn't a contradiction. They are true, Leibniz argues, by virtue of another fundamental principle, the principle of sufficient reason, M31, M33.
Sufficient reason. We touched on this with God's choice. What's the principal state generally?
M31 gives the classic formulation. Nothing happens without a reason why it is so, rather than otherwise. For every truth of fact, for every event, for every state of affairs that actually exists or occurs, there must be a sufficient reason or explanation for why it is that way, and not some other way it could have been.
A reason for everything.
A sufficient reason, yes. M32 adds a crucial point for contingent truths. This reason might be incredibly complex. It might involve tracing back through an infinite chain of previous contingent states and causes. Ultimately, the final sufficient reason for the entire series of contingent truths lies outside the series itself. It lies in God's free choice to actualize this specific sequence, this best possible world, based on the ultimate reason of maximizing perfection. So, while we might not always be able to trace the full reason due to its complexity, Leibniz insists there is one.
So every fact about the world has an explanation, even if it's infinitely complex and rooted in God's choice.
That's the core idea of the principle of sufficient reason. It underpins the intelligibility of the universe for Leibniz. It's why God had a reason for his choice, and why every state of every monad unfolds precisely as it does. There's a sufficient reason contained within its complete concept and the overall divine plan.
That principle really demands a deep rationality in the universe. Okay, so we've mapped out the monadology's core. Simple, non-interacting spiritual monads, perception and appetition driving internal change, uniqueness guaranteed by the identity of indiscernibles and complete concepts, pre-established harmony, orchestrating everything, a hierarchy of clarity from bare monads to spirits, all grounded in God's choice of the best possible world, governed by principles of contradiction and sufficient reason. Whew, it's a lot. How has this system held up over time? What's its legacy, and what are the main criticisms? Section 7.
Well, despite its challenges and density, the Monadology is undeniably a landmark work in the history of metaphysics and rationalist philosophy. It presented this astonishingly comprehensive and systematic response to the huge philosophical questions of the 17th century, weaving together metaphysics, physics, theology, psychology into this single, coherent vision.
And Leibniz's influence went far beyond just this one text, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We mentioned his co-discovery of calculus fundamental for modern science, his work on logic like the predicatum innes subjecto idea, and his dream of a universal symbolic language laid groundwork for later developments in formal logic. And his metaphysical concepts, substance, possible worlds, sufficient reason, necessity versus contingency, were massively influential, shaping the debates for philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Russell, and many others, even if they often reacted against his system. Even his scientific debates, like the vis viva controversy about the nature of force, weren't just about physics. They reflected deeper disagreements about whether reality was fundamentally mechanistic or more dynamic and, dare I say, organic, showing how his philosophy connected to scientific worldviews.
But a system this radical, this intricate, must have faced some serious pushback. What are the main criticisms that keep coming up?
One of the biggest, and we've bumped into it several times, revolves around the windowless monads and pre-established harmony. Critics just find it incredibly hard to swallow that there's no genuine interaction. How does the mere congruence of perceptions truly account for the robust feeling and effectiveness of causality in the world? Does pre-established harmony make interaction seem like just a cosmic coincidence, constantly maintained? It clashes strongly with intuition and experience.
Yeah, the lack of real interaction is tough.
Yeah.
And the best of all possible worlds argument, that's probably the most famous point of attack, right?
Without a doubt. Logically, it might follow from his premises about God's perfection, but philosophically, theologically, and just humanly, many find it deeply unsatisfying as an explanation for the sheer scale and horror of evil and suffering in the world. Accusing it of minimizing or justifying suffering is a very common reaction, famously captured by Voltaire's satire in Candide.
Right, Dr. Pangloss. And finally, just the sheer complexity.
Yes, the system is notoriously intricate, keeping track of all the moving parts, simple substances, aggregates, perception, appetition, complete concepts, harmony, God's role, the two truths, and how they all interlock requires intense focus. It's elegant in its way, but undeniably complex and abstract, making it challenging to fully grasp and assess.
So centuries later, the monadology still sparks debate and forces us to think hard about fundamental issues.
It absolutely does. It throws down the gauntlet on questions we still grapple with today. What is the ultimate nature of reality? Physical? Mental? Something else? How does mind relate to body? If there is a God, what is God's relationship to the world and to evil? What does causality really mean? How can things be interconnected if they are fundamentally distinct?
And maybe the one that hits closest to home. If our lives unfold according to a pre-established harmony, rooted in a complete concept determined from eternity, what does that mean for our sense of freedom, our choices?
Exactly. That tension between divine plan and human freedom is a perennial issue that Leibniz's system brings into sharp focus. These are the deep, enduring questions his work compels us to confront.
So to try and wrap up this deep dive, we've journeyed into Leibniz's monadology, using these sources as our guide. We've seen a universe built not of atoms, but of these countless unique, non-interacting spiritual points monads.
Each one a tiny, windowless world, unfolding its own internal story of perception and striving.
All perfectly synchronized by God's pre-established harmony, creating the appearance of the physical, causal world we experience.
A world structured in layers of clarity, from the dimmest perceptions of matter up to the self-aware reason of spirits.
All existing within what Leibniz argued is the best possible world, chosen by the perfect God from infinite possibilities.
It's a system of breathtaking scope, rigorous logic, offering these incredibly elegant, though definitely counterintuitive solutions to the major philosophical dilemmas of his day. Digging into it really forces you to question your basic assumptions about how reality works.
It certainly does. And it leaves us, as you said, with so much to chew on. Here's a final thought to take away. If every single monad contains a representation of the entire universe from its unique viewpoint, and God chose this specific harmonious arrangement as the absolute best balance of variety and order out of all infinity, what does that imply about your experience? Does it mean that every detail, every fleeting thought and sensation you have is somehow a necessary part of this optimal cosmic tapestry, pre-programmed into your complete concept? And if so, what does that really say about your choices, your individuality, your place within this vast, intricate divine architecture?
That's a heavy thought to end on. A lot to ponder.
It is indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Leibniz's monadology.